Welcome, friends, to Sci-Fi Travelers. In this episode, I'll tell you the story of human teacher Thomas, alien Queen Anna, and their 3 alien children. Sit back and get ready to dive into this amazing science fiction story. Enjoy. The alien vampire queen was shocked to see her unruly children sleeping in a human man's arms. The recruitment brochure had called it an exclusive tutoring opportunity in a culturally enriched environment, which Thomas had learned, over 31 years of reading between very optimistic lines, was the sort of phrase that meant either the pay was excellent or the survival rate was poor. In this case, it turned out to be both, which he supposed was at least honest by omission. He signed the contract in a leaking transit lounge on Kepler Station, where the recycled air smelled faintly of ozone and other people's regrets, and where the recruiter, a nervous man who kept glancing at the exits as though Thomas might change his mind and take him hostage, pushed the datapad across the table with the enthusiasm of someone handing over a live grenade. "You're sure?" the recruiter said. It wasn't really a question. "I'm broke, unemployed, and my last apartment got repossessed by an algorithm," Thomas said, thumbprinting the final page. Sureness is a luxury for the solvent. The colony he came from was one of those dwindling earth-seed worlds that nobody wrote songs about anymore. A place where the crops were stubborn, the money was theoretical, and a man with a teaching license and a gift for patience could still, occasionally, starve with dignity. So when the offer came, full board, absurd wages, transport included, Thomas had asked exactly one question that mattered, which was who the students were. And the recruiter had said the name of the Sanguine court in a hushed voice, and Thomas had gone very still because everyone knew about them. Humans called them vampires. Not scientifically, of course. The scientists had a great many careful words about convergent evolution and photosensitive dermal pigmentation and specialized hematic nutrition. But the colonists who traded with them at the dark edges of the system just looked at the pale skin and the long fangs and the ships that only moved by night. And they said the old word, and they said it quietly. The journey took 9 days, and Thomas spent most of them being cheerfully terrified in a private cabin, nicer than any room he had ever slept in, aboard a vessel so silent and black that looking out the viewport felt like staring into the inside of a closed eye. On the last night, the ship slid into orbit around a world with no sun on it worth mentioning, and docked with a city that hung in the dark like a chandelier some god had forgotten to light. The Sanguine did not care for daylight, and had solved the problem the way any sufficiently advanced and sufficiently stubborn people would. They had simply left the sun behind and taken their whole civilization somewhere it couldn't bother them. Thomas pressed his forehead to the glass, watched the spires of black glass and silver drift past studded with soft violet lamps, and said, to no one, "Well, at least it's not tacky." He was met at the airlock by a steward named Robert. The Sanguine, he would learn, had adopted many human first names over centuries of trade, finding them charmingly disposable, who was tall and gray-lipped and dressed with the crisp precision of a man who has attended a great many funerals in a professional capacity. Robert looked Thomas over the way one inspects fruit one does not intend to buy. "You're the tutor," he said. "Thomas." "Yes, we'll see." Robert turned and began walking, and Thomas hurried to keep up, his one battered bag banging against his hip. "You are the 9th this year," the steward continued pleasantly, as they passed down corridors of dark stone lit from within by veins of pale light. "I have prepared a room for you. It has a very sturdy lock, though I should tell you frankly that the lock is more to comfort you than to help you. Should the young ones wish to enter, the lock will merely give them something to do." "That's reassuring." "It isn't meant to be." Robert paused at a junction where the temperature dropped a noticeable few degrees. "The previous tutors are all quite well before you ask. Relocated, reassigned. One of them, I'm told, has taken up farming on a moon where nothing can find him, which I consider a happy ending given the alternatives." He resumed walking. "The children of Her Majesty Anna are not cruel, you understand. I want to be fair to them. They are simply spirited, sharp of tooth, and they do not sleep. Ever. This is the part that undoes most people. A human can endure a great deal, But not, it seems. 3 small persons who are awake at all hours and have opinions. They stopped before a set of doors twice Thomas's height, carved with a crest of a crescent moon swallowing a star. Somewhere behind them, something small and fast went skittering across a ceiling. Robert produced a key, hesitated, and for the first time looked at Thomas with something almost like pity. "Her Majesty is at the night council and will not return until the small hours," he said. "Which means you have until then to make an impression, or an escape. I would not judge you for the second." He pushed the doors open onto a vast, dark nursery, and every light inside it went out at once, as though someone had inhaled them. From the blackness came 3 sets of small, gleaming eyes, and one delighted, unmistakably fanged giggle. "Good luck," said Robert, and shut the doors behind him. Thomas stood very still in the dark, and did the only sensible thing a man can do when confronted by 3 invisible predators with a giggle. He sat down on the floor. This confused them enormously. He could feel it in the sudden quiet, the way the small, gleaming eyes drew closer and then hesitated, recalculating. Prey was supposed to run. Prey was supposed to fumble for the lights and shriek and make the whole business entertaining. This prey had simply folded itself onto the cold stone, crossed its legs, and begun, of all the mad things, to unpack a bag. "I've had a very long trip," Thomas announced to the darkness, in the mild tone of a man addressing a mild inconvenience. "And I'm going to have a snack, and if any of you would like to murder me, you'll have to wait until I've finished because I refuse to die hungry. It's undignified." He produced a slightly crushed protein biscuit from his bag and took a loud, deliberate bite. There was a long silence. Then a voice from somewhere near the ceiling, high and imperious and no older than 8, said, "You're supposed to be scared." "I'm exhausted," Thomas corrected. "It's different. Scared has energy in it. I've got nothing left but crumbs and a strong opinion about biscuits." He held one up into the dark. "There's another, if you want it. Fair warning, it tastes like sadness and drywall." That got the littlest one. She dropped from the shadows like a small pale spider, landed in front of him with an alarming lack of impact, and peered up at him with enormous dark eyes and 2 neat little fangs. She could not have been more than 4. She sniffed the biscuit, made a face of profound betrayal, and declared, "That's disgusting," with the delight of a child who has found something new to be horrified by. "I know," Thomas agreed gravely. "I made it myself, that's why." Behind her, the other 2 were coming down the walls now, curious in spite of themselves, a boy of perhaps 6 with wild dark hair, and a girl older than the rest, 10 at most, who kept to the edge of the light with her arms crossed and her chin up and the wary expression of someone who has been disappointed by adults before and does not intend to be caught out again. Their names, he pried loose over the next few hours, were Luna, who was small and loud and immediately his; Owen, who communicated primarily through acrobatics and had strong feelings about which parts of the ceiling belonged to him; and Cora, the eldest, who did not warm to anyone and said so repeatedly in case he'd missed it. Thomas did not try to teach them anything. He had learned, in 9 previous careers' worth of difficult children on a hard little colony world, that you never lead with the lesson. You lead with attention, which is the only currency a child truly counts. So he let them show him things. He let Owen demonstrate the exact spot on the vaulted ceiling from which one could, in theory, ambush a governess. He let Luna narrate a rambling and libelous history of every adult who had ever fled the nursery. He let Cora pretend she wasn't listening while he told them, in a low conspiratorial voice, about the world he came from, where the sun was so bright it could actually burn you. "Which is why," he said, "everyone there is either very brave or very stupid, and mostly we couldn't tell which until it was too late." The thing he noticed, somewhere past the deep middle of that endless night, was that they were tired, not sleepy. The Sanguine children genuinely did not sleep. That much was true, and a physician somewhere had a folder full of scans to prove it, but tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. a bone-deep, jangling weariness that no one had ever thought to soothe because everyone had been too busy being afraid of them. They flinched at the lights. When the nursery's soft violet glow wavered, and it wavered often, a flicker Thomas filed away without knowing why. All three of them went briefly rigid, teeth bared at nothing, before pretending it hadn't happened. Nobody had ever just held them. That was the revelation that crept up on Thomas somewhere in the small hours, sitting on that cold floor with a small, pale hand knotted absently in his sleeve. These children were feared by an entire court, and not one soul in that court had ever simply put an arm around them and let them lean. So he did. When Luna finally ran out of stories and slumped sideways against his ribs, he didn't move away. When Owen, affecting total disinterest, drifted close enough to fall asleep against his shoulder mid-sentence, Thomas let him. And when Cora, last, proudest, most exhausted of them all, crept over and settled into the crook of his other arm with her fierce little face still scowling as though daring him to comment, he said nothing at all. He simply sat there, aching and cross-legged and afraid to breathe too hard, three impossible children draped over him like sleeping cats, and understood with a sinking, tender certainty that he was in far more trouble than any lock could fix. Which was, of course, precisely the moment the great doors opened, and the Queen came home. Anna stood in the doorway and did not move because she had forgotten how. She had come home braced for catastrophe. The silence in her halls had reached her 3 corridors away, and silence in the nursery meant something had gone terribly wrong, because her children did not do silence any more than fire did cold. She had walked the last stretch quickly, then quicker, a queen's composure fraying with every step, imagining a fled tutor, an injured child, blood on the stones. And instead, she found this. The human, sitting on the floor in a pool of low violet light, with all 3 of her impossible children asleep against him. Actually asleep. Cora, who had not slept since her father died. Owen, who bit. Luna, who screamed the walls down for the simple joy of hearing them complain. All 3 of them limp and soft and breathing slow, and the human looking up at her over their heads with a tired, helpless, apologetic smile, one of Luna's small fists knotted tight in his sleeve, and he whispered, actually whispered, in the presence of his sovereign, "I'd stand, Your Majesty, but I've been colonized." For a moment Anna could not have said a single word if the throne had depended on it. She was aware of her own heartbeat, which was inconvenient, because she made a great professional habit of not being aware of anything so undignified as feelings. She had ruled this court alone for 6 years, ever since the reactor that ran the city's night cycle had failed in the worst possible way, and taken her husband with it, and in those 6 years she had built her composure into something like armor, cool and pale and unbreachable, because a widowed queen with cursed children could afford absolutely nothing else. And now a sunburned human from a colony she couldn't find on a map had walked into her nursery and done, in a single night, the one thing she had privately decided was impossible. She lingered in the doorway far longer than she meant to. She was still lingering when she realized he'd noticed, and that heat rose in her face, and that this was somehow worse than everything else. They did not speak properly until the children had been carried, one impossibly careful trip at a time, to the low couches at the room's edge, Thomas insisting on doing it himself, because Luna woke if you weren't him, a fact he seemed embarrassed to have learned so quickly. Then Anna dismissed the hovering steward with a look and sat and studied the man her entire court had warned her about. "They told me you would flee within a week," she said. "The week's not over," Thomas offered. "I like to keep my options open." Something moved at the corner of her mouth that was very nearly a smile, and thought better of it. She had a servant bring the ceremonial welcome broth, the deep crimson nutrient the Sanguine lived on, which humans invariably found alarming, and watched with unhidden interest as Thomas took a polite sip, went still, and said with great diplomatic care, "That's remarkable. It tastes like a battery apologizing to me." Anna laughed. It came out of her before she could stop it, short and startled and rusty from disuse, and she pressed her fingers to her lips as though she might catch it and put it back. She could not remember the last time she had laughed. She resented briefly and fiercely how good it felt. So they talked, the human and the queen, in the low light, while the children slept the first real sleep of their small, strange lives. She told him more than she meant to. That the children were called cursed, that the court whispered the shadow over the throne had followed them out of the reactor fire that killed their father, that even their own attendants signed protective wards before entering the nursery, that she had stopped correcting them, because a queen who protests too much only convinces people there is something to protest. Thomas listened the way he did everything, with an attentiveness that felt less like a courtier's flattery and more like being genuinely seen, which Anna found she had no defenses against whatsoever. And when she finished, he was quiet for a while, and then he said something that changed the shape of the whole night. "They flinch at the lights," he said. "Did you know that? When the glow flickers, all three of them go rigid. It's not fear of the dark, it's the flicker itself. There's a rhythm to it." He frowned, turning a cold cup of terrible broth in his hands. "And their sleeplessness has a rhythm too. It gets worse when the city's night cycle stutters. I noticed it 3 or 4 times tonight. Every time the lights hiccuped, they woke halfway, like something had reached in and pinched them." He looked up. "Has anyone ever checked whether it's not the children that are broken, Your Majesty? Whether it might be something in the room?" Anna went very still, and this time it had nothing to do with heartbeats. 6 years of physicians and wards and whispered curses, and no one, not one of them, had ever suggested the fault might lie in the walls rather than the blood. She opened her mouth to answer, and that was the precise moment the door chimed, and the minister Adrian let himself in without waiting, gray-eyed and smiling, his gaze moving from the sleeping children to the human, to his queen, with an interest that was a fraction too keen. "Your Majesty," he said smoothly, "I heard the most extraordinary thing, that the tutor survived." His smile widened. "How fortunate." The archives of the Sanguine court were housed in a cold vault beneath the city, where centuries of records hung in the dark as slivers of crystal, each one holding more information than a human library, and organized according to a logic that Thomas privately suspected had been designed by someone who hated him personally. He had no business being down there. That was rather the point. In the days since Adrian had let himself into the nursery with that too keen smile, Thomas had felt the shape of something wrong pressing against the edges of every polite conversation, and he had learned long ago that when a powerful man is that interested in whether you've died yet, the healthiest response is to find out why. So he had asked Cora to help him, because Cora, proud, prickly, 10-year-old Cora, who trusted no one, and had therefore learned to notice everything, turned out to be an alarmingly competent lookout. She perched at the top of the vault stairs with her sharp little chin on her knees and hissed, "Someone's coming," at intervals precise enough to give him a heart condition, and twice she was right, and both times they were only a maintenance drone, but Thomas thanked her gravely each time anyway, because being taken seriously was a thing she had clearly been starved of. What he found once he'd bullied the Crystal Index into cooperating was a maintenance log for the nursery's environmental systems. The light, the air, the gentle recycled atmosphere the children breathed every hour of their sleepless lives, and buried in 6 years of tedious readings was a pattern so quiet that only a man who had spent those same 6 years noticing quiet things would ever have caught it. Trace elements. A compound cycling into the nursery's air and light spectrum in doses too small to register as an alarm, too regular to be an accident, timed. And here Thomas's blood went cold in a way the terrible broth never had, timed precisely to the flicker in the lights. Every stutter of the night cycle was a dose. The children hadn't been fighting a curse for 6 years. They'd been fighting a slow, patient poison, one calibrated with exquisite care, not to kill them, but to keep them exactly as they were, jangling, sleepless, sharp-toothed, and above all, defective, frightening enough that no one would look closely, broken enough that no one would ever call them fit to inherit a throne. He sat back on the cold stone floor of the vault and felt sick, and then he felt something worse, which was understanding. a poison that kept the heirs unfit, a shadow the court could blame on the children themselves, and a grieving, isolated queen, worn thin by 6 years of whispers, slowly being maneuvered toward the one conclusion everyone seemed so eager for her to reach, that she could not manage her own children, her own court, her own crown. It wasn't a curse. It was a campaign. Thomas thought of Adrian's smile, of the way the minister's gaze had moved across that sleeping room like an accountant tallying assets, and he thought, "You have been building this for years, and I have been here for a week, and I have found you, and you have no idea," which felt, for exactly 4 seconds, extremely triumphant, right up until the more experienced part of his brain pointed out that a man who finds the thing a murderer has spent 6 years hiding is not clever. He is a loose end. He was still assembling the courage to feel properly afraid about that when Cora hissed from the stairs, and this time her voice was different, thin, tight, wrong, and Thomas was on his feet before he'd finished thinking, crystal record clutched in one hand, and Adrian was already at the bottom of the steps with 2 attendants at his shoulders, and that same patient smile fixed in place. "You know," the minister said pleasantly, "I had begun to think you were merely lucky. It's almost a relief to find you're a thief instead. So much simpler to explain." His gaze dropped to the crystal in Thomas's hand, then flicked deliberately to Cora frozen on the stairs. A human, alone in the royal archives, filling a child's head with paranoid nonsense and stealing court records. The queen will be so disappointed. She had such hopes for you. He held out one pale hand. "The record, please. And the girl comes with me." "No," said Thomas, and put himself between Adrian and the stairs without deciding to, the way you put your hand out to catch a falling cup. Not bravery, just the body refusing the alternative. Behind him he heard Cora's breath catch. "She goes back to the nursery. You can frame me for whatever you like. I'm a foreigner with terrible references. No one will blink. But you don't touch her." Adrian studied him for a long, unhurried moment, and something genuinely curious crossed his face, as though Thomas were a mildly interesting equation that had refused to solve. "How strange you are," he murmured. "You truly care." Then he nodded to his attendants, and to Thomas's horror the smile widened, warm and terrible, and he said, "Take him somewhere quiet, and restore the nursery's cycle to its accelerated setting. The children have been far too calm lately. We can't have people asking why." They put Thomas in a storeroom with a lock that was, ironically, far sturdier than the one Robert had given him for comfort, and he spent the first 90 seconds of his imprisonment discovering that he was not, temperamentally, built for dignified despair. He tried the door. He tried the door again, in case it had changed its mind. He was halfway through an undignified assessment of the ventilation grill when it occurred to him that Cora had not come with him, that Adrian, for all his patience, had made the single error of a man who has never been 10 years old and furious, which was to assume a frightened child runs toward safety rather than toward the person she has decided is hers. The grill was already loose. Small pale fingers were already working it free from the other side. "You're slow," Cora informed him, dropping into the storeroom in a scatter of dust, her fierce little face streaked and set. "I've been in the walls for ages. This whole city is walls if you're small enough. Mother needs to know. Adrian's going to hurt them. He's turning it up. I heard him." And her voice cracked, just slightly, on the last word, and Thomas knelt and took her by the shoulders and said, "Then we're going to go tell her, and we're going to be faster than he is, and I promise you, Cora, I have never once in my life been on time for anything, so this is going to be very out of character and very impressive." The run through the sunless city was the worst and finest thing Thomas had ever done. Cora led him through the bones of the place, the crawl spaces and service vanes the Sanguine had built for maintenance drones and never for grown men, and Thomas, bruised, wheezing, entirely out of his depth, kept up by the simple method of refusing to consider the alternative. "How much farther?" he gasped, folding himself around a coolant pipe. "You said that 4 turns ago." I was optimistic 4 turns ago. Optimism is dead. It died back there by the big fan. He hauled himself up a ladder that had not been designed with lungs in mind. Cora, sweetheart, if we survive this, I am going to sleep for a week and you are all going to have to learn to entertain yourselves. And I want you to understand that this is a threat. She almost laughed. He heard it catch in her throat and turn into something braver, and she climbed faster, and he followed. They reached the Night Council chamber as its great doors were closing, and Thomas did the only thing his ridiculous body knew how to do, which was to throw himself through the gap and land, spectacularly, on the polished floor at the feet of the assembled Sanguine court, in front of the throne, in front of the ministers, in front of Adrian, who had beaten them there. Of course he had, and was mid-sentence in some grave and reasonable account of the human thief and the poor deluded queen. The chamber went silent. Anna rose from the throne, white-faced, and for one terrible instant Thomas saw the 6 years of whispers pulling at her, saw how easy it would be to believe the smooth minister over the wheezing foreigner sprawled on her floor, and then Cora dropped through the crawlspace hatch above and landed beside him, and said, in a voice that carried to every corner of that ancient room, "He's poisoning us. He's been poisoning us since Father died. Thomas found it. It's in the lights." And Anna looked at her eldest daughter, her proud, sleepless, never-crying daughter, standing there with tears on her face and her chin up, and the queen's expression changed into something Adrian had spent 6 patient years making sure he would never have to see. It came apart quickly after that, the way these things do once the first honest thing is said aloud. Thomas held up the crystal record, a court technician ordered by a queen who had stopped asking questions and started giving commands, read the nursery's true logs into the open air, the doses, the timing, the flicker that was never a fault, but a schedule. And when Adrian opened his mouth to explain it all away in that warm, reasonable voice, it was Owen and Luna, carried in wild-eyed by a frantic Robert, roused mid-treatment, and utterly enraged, who undid him, because Luna took one look at the man who had made the lights hurt for her entire small life, pointed a trembling finger, and shrieked, "Him!" And there is no smile in the universe smooth enough to survive being identified by a furious 4-year-old. The ministers who had drifted toward Adrian's orbit drifted, very suddenly, away from it. The guards who answered to the crown remembered whose crown it was. Later, much later, when Adrian had been taken somewhere with a lock, even he couldn't smile through, and the nursery's poison had been purged from the air on Anna's own shouted order, and the children had been checked and held and checked again. Thomas found himself alone with the queen in the quiet of the emptied chamber, aching in places he hadn't known could ache. "You came back," Anna said. "You were locked away and framed, and you had every reason to run, and you came back through the walls of my city with my daughter." He shrugged and winced, because shrugging hurt now. "I told you, options open." And Anna crossed the space between them and took his tired face in her pale hands and stopped pretending, the way he had stopped pretending days ago without ever admitting it. And neither of them said anything clever at all for quite some time, which for Thomas was a personal record. The sun lamps arrived 6 weeks later, which caused a minor constitutional crisis. The Sanguine had spent the better part of an age arranging their entire civilization around the firm principle of never again being bothered by a sun, and now here was the human consort. The phrase still made half the court choke on their broth, installing warm golden lights in the royal nursery on the recommendation of a physician who had, after the poison was purged, finally been allowed to actually examine the children instead of just fearing them. It turned out the young of the Sanguine were not meant to be sleepless at all. It turned out they needed a little warmth, a little light, a proper rhythm of dark and glow, the same as any small growing thing anywhere in the galaxy, and that 6 years of a stuttering sabotage night cycle had cheated them of it. So the lamps went in, over a great deal of muttering, and on the first evening they were lit, Luna stood beneath one with her arms spread and her eyes shut and announced that she was having a feeling, and the feeling turned out to be contentment, which she had apparently never encountered before and deeply distrusted. They slept now. That was the miracle that had quietly rearranged the entire court, more than any decree could have. The children of Queen Anna, feared through every hall, warded against by their own attendants, blamed for the shadow over the throne, slept through the night like ordinary children and terrorized the palace by day like ordinary children, which was to say thoroughly, joyfully, and with a complete disregard for anyone's schedule. Owen had taken to ambushing ministers from the ceilings, and since the ministers now understood that the boy was not a cursed omen, but simply a 6-year-old who liked heights, they had learned to laugh about it, which did more to heal the court's long fear than any purge of poison. Cora no longer kept to the edges of rooms. She had discovered in the weeks since she'd led a wheezing human through the walls of a city to save her family that she was brave and clever and worth listening to, and she carried this knowledge with the faint, insufferable pride of a child who has always suspected it and finally has proof. She had also, without ever once saying so, decided that Thomas was permanent, and enforced this decision by leaving her homework on his knee. Adrian's name was struck from the rolls, his ministry dissolved, his patient 6-year campaign undone in a single honest evening, and the court, examining the wreckage of what he'd nearly accomplished, found itself faced with an uncomfortable question. He had not acted alone in spirit, even if he'd acted alone in fact. The whispers about the cursed children had been a thing the whole court had been happy to believe, because it was easier than the truth, which was that a grieving queen had been left to struggle alone while ambitious men measured her crown. Anna, to her lasting credit, did not purge them all. She simply ruled, openly and warmly, and without the armor she'd worn for 6 years, and let the court watch a family heal in the light, and it turned out that shame did more honest work than exile ever could. As for Robert, the steward who had once listed the fates of 9 tutors with funeral gravity, he had appointed himself the children's principal co-conspirator, and could frequently be found holding one end of a bedsheet the young ones had decided was a sail. "I told you the lock was for your comfort," he said to Thomas once, watching Luna scale a curtain. "I never said comfort was wise." And Thomas, colony boy, 9th tutor, professional survivor of optimistic brochures, had changed in a way he could not have named on the leaking transit lounge where he'd signed his life away for the pay. He had come to this dark city with his options open, as he liked to say, because keeping your options open was what you did when you had learned not to expect anything to keep you. He had spent 31 years being cheerfully unattached, a man who could pack his whole life in one battered bag and did again and again, because staying had never once been offered. And somewhere between a floor full of sleeping children and a run through the walls of a city and a queen taking his tired face in her hands, he had put the bag down. He did not need it anymore. He had, without noticing the moment it happened, stopped being a man who was passing through and become a man who had arrived, which was the one thing 31 years of colonies and contracts had never taught him how to be, and which 3 impossible children and their impossible mother had taught him in a single strange season without meaning to. He thought about all of it on a quiet evening near the end of that season, standing in the doorway of the nursery he had once been shoved into like a sacrifice. The golden lamps were low. Owen was asleep across a cushion with one foot improbably above his head. Luna had colonized an actual pillow for once instead of a person, though her small hand was still fisted in the blanket the way it had once fisted in his sleeve. And Cora had fallen asleep mid-argument with a book, scowling faintly even in her dreams, exactly as fierce and exactly as safe as a child ought to be. Thomas stood there and did not go in, because he did not want to wake them, and because the sight was worth standing still for. He did not hear Anna arrive. He only felt her, pale and warm, come to rest against his shoulder in the doorway, the same doorway where she had once stood frozen, unable to believe a human held her untamable children as gently as his own. She looked at her sleeping court, and then at the man beside her, and the queen who had not let herself want anything in 6 years, let herself lean, fully, into the one thing she had. "You're still here," she murmured, not quite a question. "Turns out," Thomas said softly, "I ran out of options." And he took her hand, and the two of them lingered in the doorway far longer than either meant to, watching the children sleep in the light. And this time, it was Anna who finally stepped inside and drew him with her into the warm and unremarkable and altogether extraordinary quiet of a home. They called them cursed because it was easier than the truth. It's always easier to name a child difficult than to ask what's hurting them, to fear what we haven't taken the time to hold. For 6 years, a whole court looked at 3 sleepless children and saw a shadow, when all along the shadow was in the walls, in the light, in the quiet cruelty of people too comfortable to look closer. And it took an outsider, tired, broke, expecting nothing, to simply sit down on the floor and pay attention. Maybe that's the thing worth carrying out of this story. That the most frightening people in our lives are often just the least held. That someone has to be brave enough to stay when everyone else has planned their escape. And that the walls we build to keep ourselves safe, the armor, the open options, the bag always packed by the door, protect us from exactly the thing we're most starving for. So here is what the story leaves you with, quietly, in the doorway of your own life. Who in your world has been called difficult when they were only unseen? What have you been too afraid to hold still long enough to love? And that bag you keep packed, just in case. What might happen if one ordinary evening you finally set it down and let yourself walk in? We've reached the end of another science fiction story, friends. Before we go, I have a small request. Please like the story, leave your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to Sci-Fi Traveler so you don't miss the next one. See you soon in the next story.